Okay, Josh. uh, so happy to talk to you, and I have some interesting things that I'd love to discuss with you. Yeah, maybe in general, I just think you're an amazing spiritual teacher, very clear pointer. Yeah, an amazing guy in that you have a lot of teachers that maybe can share some truth, but what I like with you as well is that you live it, you energetically bring that to the table, but also I think that you're quite strong in sensing with people what works, because when I look at some of the satsangs you're doing, I really love how you're interacting with people and just bring this very loving vibe to them. It's like this patience that's sometimes not there with certain teachers. um so
Yeah,
yeah, that's really great. Nice
it's
to
pretty
have you on this.
effortless to meet people. Yeah.
Yeah. And so maybe for people who don't know, you had an awakening or maybe even further experience with your first retreat, actually having no experience before that with anything spiritual, right? You went to like the first retreat with Angelo, right? The first sitting, and you already had this huge experience.
Yeah. I had been invited to a 1 day retreat. I think it was just going to take place over a few hours, and the first round of meditation was guided. We sat down, and as I was sitting there during the guided, I felt something happening. I can't really describe it, but it was just like a something was coming on, and it felt as if I had kind of burst out of the head
Mm.
and didn't have hands or legs, or there was no more perception of a body anymore. It was just um, color and shapes, and it felt like traveling at a really high rate of speed.
Yeah, would you say it's like, do you think it was kind of like a Kundalini experience as well?
Tough to say.
Yeah.
Don't have a ton of experience with Kundalini. Every once in a while, I can feel some kind of energy move, but it what it felt like was at first it was like the hands had somehow swollen or something. They had swollen to
Mm.
the size of the house. It just felt like I was somehow growing in size. And then it was just like a sudden burst of somehow being, it felt like traveling at the speed of light toward the center of the universe. That was the only way I could possibly put it into words. But
Mm.
there was also a really profound sense of losing time also during that. Um, Felt like maybe a couple minutes of that before I heard the bell, and I was suddenly kind of drawn back into this body. And opening the eyes, everything kind of had a golden glow to it. Everything was really vivid in color. And before coming, we hadn't eaten any snacks or anything, but it was very much like a psychedelic experience. So it was kind of like looking around. There was just a very, I don't know, it was almost like stepping into a new, more vivid experience.
Yeah. And was it for you like, because you often hear about people experiencing more like first the like blowing up to like the everythingness and then sudden collapse into a sort of nothingness. And then sometimes that happens like in one experience. I don't know if is it was it something like that, or do you feel that this was more of the everything aspect for you?
Yeah, it definitely felt, the way it's kind of put itself into intuition or a pointing is it felt like an expansion, like going supernova, I guess is the best way to put it. And then that lasted about 6 months, just a continuous feeling of expansion. And then at around 6 months, it started to seemingly go the other direction and become a black hole, essentially.
Yeah. 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 That's super interesting. And because you had that one moment, let's say that activation moment, but like you said, there's probably this whole journey afterwards. I don't know, maybe it's too early to say integration, but it's kind of like that it's still active, it's still happening in you, right? I was like this because I think you said somewhere else that the 2 years or 2.5 years afterwards you kind of disappeared. So I'm curious what happened in that time and what um
Yeah,
yeah,
I don't really know. It was there was like a another prolonged experience, maybe another 6 months. The funny thing is, I don't actually know how long any of this really took because it's kind of clear that this has to be made up to some degree in memory.
yeah,
It seems about that amount of time. It feels like half a year. Felt like right around that time of experience, but even then, tough to say. But it was like a very deep, strong pulling into sensation and feeling that there was a clear resistance or avoidance to. Um, and then toward what I would just call the end of that particular aspect of the experience, there was just a complete dropping away, like a pop, like being gone. And then I was on Facebook one day, and I Angelo had posted something. It was an interview with somebody, and I simply just commented, "Oh, that looks really fun." And the next thing I know, my phone started getting text messages, and it was Angelo, and it said, "Where have you been? Did you go into the cave? It's been a long time." And I'm like, "What do you mean it's been a long time?" And he goes, "Yeah, it's been 2.5 years since we last spoke." And I was like, "What?" So I went back through the text messages and I saw that there was, it shows the time stamp and it
yeah.
said there was about 30 months of a gap there. And I have no idea. It didn't feel like any time had passed at all. So I became really curious what happened over the last 2.5 years because it didn't seem like, well, first of all, it didn't seem like there was a gap in experience here, but there was also no real memory of what happened during that period of time. It wasn't like going quiet and somehow sleeping for 2.5 years. It was just like I'm here and then I'm here. It was like a sudden nothing
Yeah,
changed.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
But when
but yeah.
but apparently in this relative time frame, time had passed and it just didn't seem like anything had happened. So I asked family and friends, what was it like? How how did Josh appear during this period? And everyone basically said the same thing. Oh yeah, just pretty normal, everything was basically the same. And sometimes we went to baseball games and sometimes we, had Christmas and I just didn't have any sense of time had passed at all.
And do you remember those Christmases or something like that, or those baseball games, or you have no
No
active
idea. I
memory
mean,
of that?
pretty much most past memory, there seems to be every once in a while like a sense of a buffering, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks of what I could call a buffer, but then that also will quickly collapse, and there really isn't much reference to anything in the past at all. Not a lot of memory.
Yeah,
I can feel the outset of attempting to remember something, and it feels a lot like creating a memory. I don't know how else to put that. It's almost like I'm going to create it right now, and then I can tell you something that happened. But
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's
It's
also
kind of
clear
like
that nothing
you
happened.
want. So it's something maybe you want to remember that you think like, oh, this is important. I need to remember that or something like that, or not.
It's almost like I can play the game of memory with you if you would like,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
it doesn't feel necessary, and it definitely doesn't feel real.
Yeah.
And people will recall things all the time, and they're human beings. Were often interfacing with this experience that we call memory. But if we really look at it, um, based on each human being's experience or whatever it is, it does never align. Even if somebody remembers something similar in theme, it's never the same. It's completely different. And then what we usually do is we say, well, it's relative. It's based on the observer, and the observer decides. But I'm not certain that there is any objective memory or objective past at all. It seems as if it's just kind of a game that we play.
Yeah, it's also, I think, a lot overlapped with just the perspectives that people have, right? With their their selfing, their personal filter, I think is in the way of a lot of that, maybe even,
For
or
sure.
even is creating that. Yeah.
But there's been a lot of feeling, in addition to that, of a collapsing of cause and effect narrative. And that's really all memory is doing, is giving us a sense of a narrative, a continuous self that somehow exists throughout this stretched span of what we would call time. But if we really sit with that objectively and literally, it actually starts to collapse into there's really only this experience, and it's just this ongoingness of experience that gives us a sense of time. But there is no time. There's no future moment. There's no past moment. There's only this ongoingly.
Yeah, and then you can have certain moments where your memory is taking a snapshot as a thought and kind of recording that, right?
And then when you
Uh,
look at that, when you look at the way that is functioning, it actually doesn't exist. It's attempting to model something about this right here, right now, but giving us a sense of departuring or departing from right here, right now. And that's where the trick is taking place because there is no departing from right here, right now. There never has been. So
yeah,
to go back into memory is silly because there's nothing actually there. It's like actually being made up. It's being made up.
yeah, it's a thought, right? Like there's no memory, there's only thoughts. That's about the past, and probably those thoughts are very malleable in a way.
I mean, it's clear that there is even no past. It's just a thought that's happening right close to now, in this very short buffer period of now.
Yeah, because you said about the buffering. I was is that a sort of can you explain to me what you meant with that? That you feel that the memory is sort of buffering.
Yeah, it's almost like it creates a little bit of a cushion in experience. It's a slight sense of
Hmm,
departure.
hmm,
And in our relative experience, it seems like that can be useful because it seems as if all human beings are playing the game of memory. But if we sit with, let's say you have a pet, like a dog or a cat, and you sit with your dog or a cat, you'll see how that particular buffering begins to break down because it's only happening here. It's not being shared with your pet who is ever present. And so it's almost like a collective experience of attempting to expand our sense of what we can call time or the present moment. But at its most fundamental level, what seems to be really happening there is experience and reflection on experience in thought. And what it seems to happen is if we subscribe a little bit more to thought, that expansion or that buffering, we can call it a cushion, seems to expand a little bit. And that gives us a sense of this direction, which we would call past, and then this direction, which we would call future.
hmm,
But if we allow that to break down, and it's always breaking down on its own, we find that there's none of that that's actually occurring now. And there's only
hmm.
now because I cannot verify any of then.
Yes, yeah, yeah. It's even hard to verify the now, right? To verify what is this? There's no,
Even this, that's another way
yeah,
to put it. Even this doesn't really seem to exist because as we begin to
no,
investigate it, there's no evidence that any of this is actually palpably real on any level. The only way
yeah,
we can really verify is using some form of comparison and contrasting. And
yeah,
when we're absolutely completely immersed or engaged with whatever this is, there's nothing left to compare or to contrast it to. So there is no more verification. There's just a sense of emptiness. And emptiness is interesting because a lot of people's minds will create a sense of nothing with emptiness, but it's not quite that. It's it's not quite nothing, it's not quite everything, but it is something that we could just call total or complete. It doesn't have any other reference other than itself. And it's almost like the eye cannot see the eye. If the eyes are looking around, they don't see the eye, they don't perceive of the eye.
hmm,
It's so complete it doesn't perceive of itself because there is no object there at all. So we call that emptiness.
yeah. It's beautiful. I think from this, what feels or what resonates with me is that with my own experience, I've noticed throughout the years that I find memory less and less interesting. and when I'm just in my day, because probably there's less because there's less interest in memory, there's less interest to sort of fine tune or reference or adjust or change yourself, whatever that is. There's not really a feeling for me of that. Um, then also memory of like what have I done today is not even. I can remember if I want, but it's kind of never coming up again because I used to be a real thought that came up a lot, like how was my day or what did I do today, or could I maybe even done better or something like that. But all that is seemingly not relevant anymore. So
That's
that's kind of what you're taking that a bit further, of course. But
like even on an experiential level, a memory or thought, it's something that we can investigate a little bit more directly. So here's a small example. Let's say the thought says something about a phone. I don't know if you can see it.
yeah,
I
yeah,
want to blend in. Maybe this is more visible.
yeah,
A cup. The
yeah,
thought says something about the cup, but in picking up the cup and in feeling the cup and feeling the weight, the temperature, the texture, none of that is actually contained in the thought. So it's almost like a memory is attempting to essentially generalize an experience that cannot be verified. And if it cannot be verified, it doesn't exist because all that we have that exists is inexperience right here, right now. So not only is it not relevant, but there isn't anything here.
yeah,
So if we look at these thoughts simply as suggestions, and we can say that maybe thought is playing a game of potential, there is nothing palpably present of potential, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not an aspect of reality. It just means, though, that in our temporal experience of here, now, that thought cannot actually exist. So then we can start playing with those aspects of thoughts, even in an experiment. Can we know a thought that we haven't had another thought about? And what we start to see is it's its own construct of assuming that there are other thoughts, when in reality, the thought can really only interface with itself. No matter how certain we become about thoughts interfacing with something else, when we go to verify it, we can only find a thought referring to itself. And this is the essence of all form, is when we're interacting with what is perceived to be form, it's only self-verifying. In other words, phone is phone. There's no actual relationship built into phone other than phone. So I could put it this way as a pointing. In the cosmic dictionary, if one were to look up the word enlightenment, the definition would simply say enlightenment. It's all self referencing. But when we start to recognize emptiness, and that's a lot of what this path is recognizing the emptiness of all things, we start to see that everything that seems to have apparent form at its most fundamental is also inherently empty. Because I cannot even verify that any of this exists. It's this strange experience of subject object. And what we don't really realize is that subject and object have a relationship. And in that relationship, that's where we find what we truly are. We are the attention, the gap, the space between these apparent objects, because even subject itself is an object. We're objectifying subject. And in order to objectify subject, we must require object. But what about the relationship, the space that seems to be between? We start to realize that the relationship is experience, experience is attention, and attention seems to be touching everything simultaneously. So
it's
how
so
can there be
inter
a cause and effect
yeah.
there, you know?
Yeah, it's so interesting that when subject and object both are empty, that it sort of seems to forget itself. So it's how deep this rabbit hole goes with the non-existence thing. That so much things start to you could say unravel themselves
The
because
certainty of
because there's
existence.
no there it's kind of like it's it's all going downhill with the with when you see one thing is empty, you see the other thing is empty, and it's like a ping pong ball of that's destroying everything on its path, you could say.
Yeah, it's a sense of creating reference where there is none. It would
Yeah,
be like asking you to take a small pail of water and asking you to take your hand and divide that pail. of water into four equal parts of water. And you can put your hand in there and splash around. And when you pull your hand out, it's just water.
Yeah.
And so there seems to be these temporal or temporary experiences, we could say, of form. But if we sit and become still enough and rest in the pause and just let the silence overtake, we start to recognize that there really is no form, because it seems to be this dynamic aspect of an expression returning to emptiness, returning to expression, returning to emptiness. And soon that particular pattern of whatever seems to be going on breaks down, and it's somehow simultaneously both form and empty. And that's what the Heart Sutra is really pointing to, is that emptiness is form and form is also emptiness. Is to rest in that, we see that there's a simultaneity of what the mind would only see as a paradox, but the experience itself, it somehow matches, it somehow resonates as a sudden, literal, and obvious truth. That's really interesting.
It's somehow the same thing, like form and emptiness, right? This two sides of the same coin, because it's very cool that you, I think on the journey, or this has been my experience, that you maybe first start to see, okay, form is empty, and then emptiness itself is empty, you could say, but then they're also both one and also both present in the same thing, mixed, and you can't really, like the water, you can't really um you pull them apart, right? It's just both aspects of the same thing.
Right. And it constantly reveals itself in this paradoxical way. I mean, any perceived um, sense of separation with experience is actually a paradox revealing itself. And in that
Yeah.
paradox, we start to see that there's a simultaneity. It's both and it's neither at the same time. It's absolutely still and permanent, but also dynamic and impermanent simultaneously. It's like this inertia. And this is where it starts to become more profoundly revealed. Insights are very interesting here, because there is a wisdom that is absolutely built into all human experience. It doesn't matter what era human beings existed, and it doesn't matter what words we use, we recognize the insight to be the same. And for us uniquely in that visceral experience, it seems like a new insight. And then we start to recognize that insight showing up in biblical scripture, in Buddhist doctrine, in Hebrew Talmud, over and over and over. This wisdom has been here the entire time, even though in this temporal experience it seems to be brand new. And that's the funniest part about pointing and teaching, or whatever you want to say, is we're saying the same thing over and over and over, but sometimes that combination of words just resonates just right at the right time for the right person. And they stop staring at the end of that finger and they start now referring to what the finger is pointing to, the moon itself. And I suppose the way I could put it is the moon only resides here, the truth. So pay attention to truth, pay attention to your truth, because that's the only truth that exists, but it doesn't necessarily mean it exists apart. And just continuously and tirelessly make sure that that's true. And all that looks like is a form of engagement, which we don't really actually have agency around. It's happening
Mhm.
regardless.
Yeah, it's like attention is steering itself if you let go of wanting to steer attention, right?
That's it. And
Yeah.
I I think what works really well for people initially is paying attention to the agency or the agent of attention, and noticing how there's an agent of attention somehow looking at thought, and then maybe an agent of attention somehow looking into senses. If that's the case, that's a primary agent right there. And that's what we're looking for, is the most direct primary experience. And so if you can recognize that primary agent of attention, continue turning that attention into sensation and seeing if it's something you can choose at all, or if it's always there and you cannot be away from it.
And let's say for somebody, because I think for most people it's kind of like something that's persistent, right? It's a sort of persistent thought, you could say, or thought energy, belief, etc., in a sort of self. Um, how would you encourage people to explore that, just to get as close as possible to this experience of you or a solidity in the body, or how are you pointing to that
It seems to
mostly?
show. It seems to show up in. I guess we could call it layers. It's like
Yeah.
you could say it's like layers of an onion, or you could even say it's like a ball of rubber bands. And every time you penetrate through, pieces start to spring off as you penetrate. It doesn't matter which direction you come from, you still have to move through all the layers to reach this perceived or this anticipated center of experience. To it's a Buddhist pointing. Dogen said, "We must know ourselves before we forget ourselves, before the no
Mm,
self experience." And essentially what we're doing is we're diving into what feels like our experience, our center of experience, and seeing if, what's there, seeing if there's anything verifiably true in that, or if there's a point of emanation, attention heading from something towards something, all of these things. It's just a play. And it seems like the Ouroboros is a really powerful symbol here, the serpent that swallows its own tail. It seems like most human beings live their lives as if they are the head of the serpent. For most of their lives, they're pursuing something, they're consuming experiences, they're consuming relationships, kind of like going after something, acquiring. And then along the path, at some point, we get another perspective and we see that the serpent is swallowing its own tail. And we start to realize that that's a very personalized symbol or metaphor, that I am consuming myself actually somehow. There's nothing else to consume. And so then we start to take the journey from the head of the serpent and we become the tail. And by doing so, we allow ourselves to be consumed. So, to kind of put
mm,
that in a more simplistic way, we move from what we know, and what we seem to know is all thought oriented, and we move into what's unknown and what we think we know, or what we don't spend a lot of time with. And there's tends to be this massive gap or shadow over sensational experience. We start to discover that what we feel in our body is often being overshadowed by thoughts. We're looking at sensations as problems that we want to solve, and we're looking at these experiences as something that's in the way. And so we start to bring our attention into that space, and we start to discover that sensation and sensing is vastly unknown, even though the mind is attempting to create an object out of that experience. Without the thought, we can't know what that sensation is, but somehow attention can still orient to sensation. It's almost slightly objectified. It can seem like it's located somewhere, so on and so forth. So it gives a place for attention to essentially reside that is not thought. And as we continue to do so, it starts to unfold on its own. It starts to blossom and basically show us that the unknown itself is the only place that we ever discover joy. That the known is
mm.
actually the place where suffering exists. It's all about what's known and satisfying. And so we begin to take this path into the unknown on a regular basis, to the point where we're never not taking the path into the unknown. And what we find there is no one home, no one driving, nothing here.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah, and what comes up for me is, as you said, this is like, I love the Dogen quote, by the way, is that authentic ego, right? It's kind of like we need a sort of confidence to first explore just what we actually want, what our wants and desires and ideas and thoughts and beliefs, what they are currently as they are, not sort of painted with a spiritual sauce of oh we're so loving, no, we can be angry, that's okay, and why are we angry, and what is here, like the exploration of what is here without any judgment. For example, when you, I think, very common thing for me on the path, like very deep thing, but I think for a lot of people, it's just the I'm not good enough, or some lack belief, and of course, if you would ask them rationally, they would never say I'm not enough, right? Because why would I not be enough? That
Sure.
rationally doesn't make sense, but it's about emotionally, or it's about is a part of you having that experience, and just authentically recognizing or seeing that before you're interested in deconstructing that, uh,
Yeah.
I think is very, yeah, very important.
An inquiry that can be juicy, along with what you just shared, is what wants to hide. And what we start to find is that our sense of lacking is actually hidden because we continue to turn away from it. And it starts to make sense to us what's happening, that there's a series of reactions. We can call these buffers also, a series of stepping away from experience and then stepping away from that and then stepping away from that and stepping away from that, that keeps us in this perpetual state of basically dissonance, because we're being sucked in, is the best way to put it, or we are so inherently present that the attempt to pull away from presence leads to an experience that we could just call suffering. And what we are at our truest nature is something akin to intimacy, vulnerability, and innocent, a playful curiosity that resides at the core of truest nature. It seems to be ubiquitous amongst all beings, especially human beings. And this sense of lacking is actually a way that the mind is objectifying or attempting to create an object out of this unknown experience of innocence, because innocence is vastly unknown. And so what it does is it first creates a sense of shame around our innocence or sense of lacking. And then it starts to build this, what we call a ring of protection around that shame. And this is why most people's sense of lacking remains hidden to some degree, because intellectually we don't see the lacking, but we feel that lacking. And we start to recognize that our lacking is always demonstrated in the ways that we compensate for certain things. I need to be smarter. I need to be better. I need to have some hierarchy of experience. I need to pursue happiness. Why do we need to do these things at all if we're already whole? Then we start to see what lives in that shadow, something that we haven't looked at directly before. And at first, it looks like something dark and something painful until we penetrate into it. And then we find, oh, it's being co opted and changed just through a context. All shame really is innocence. And when we realize that
Mm.
firsthand in experience, um, we also realize there's no one home. So it goes back to that Dogen pointing. We must know ourselves before we forget ourselves. The knowing of ourselves has nothing to do with our intellectual activities. It has everything to do with our feeling, the way we are interacting with our sensational experience. And the deeper we go into that, the more we find that there's nothing there. So it's strange. It's almost like we become so authentic that we discover that there's no one home.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful, beautiful. I think what you touched on, which is another paradox on the path, is the whole um like practice, no practice, or doing, non-doing. Like people say you don't need to do anything, right? But then, of course, most people that say that, or most people, teachers that say something like that, actually have done, 10, 20 years of meditation or something like that, which is totally fine. But it's a very interesting paradox because I can understand like enlightenment or what we are is our natural state. So, but of course we've been deluding ourselves for years before that, or sort of piling up conditioning or however you like to call it. So something needs to let go of those energetic investments or honor them in a way where they even want to let go. Um, but I'm very curious of how you see that paradox because it
Mhm.
definitely is a paradox, right? Practice,
Yeah,
no practice, or
there's actually a really subtle factor that's actually part of all of that that we tend to overlook, and it comes down to curiosity. So we don't actually need anything, but that doesn't mean that we've come in contact with this aspect of curiosity. And a way to put this is, if we were to say innocence as a noun, curiosity is the dynamic, the verb of what is innocent, the
mm,
playfulness, the curiosity. And so, what all practices are actually, in essence, intended to do is catalyze or give us an impetus of curiosity. That's all they're for. If you look at what self inquiry is, you look at any practice, meditation, anything you can imagine, it's all to catalyze a sense of curiosity. And once we have a recognition or a reconciliation with the essence of curiosity, that's when we realize there's nothing left to do. So it is true, there's nothing left to do, but that doesn't mean that a lot of people have strong contact with curiosity, because the identity lives in certainty and conclusion. And certainty and conclusion are the antithesis of what is curious. we refuse to engage in curiosity with what we're certain about. And so, what we're intending to do is kind of break that up a little bit through practices. Oftentimes, that can feel uncomfortable or bring about some kind of new experience. And from there, that essence of curiosity seems to take us the rest of the way. And we find that this is absolutely an organic and natural unfolding. In fact, it's not unfolding at all, it's already done.
Yeah, that's the time thing, right? With the already done. Yeah, it feels like the curiosity. Would you say that that's like a with the Rubik's cube? You need to want to look at yourself. You need to want to switch to all sides, and play with it, right? What are you experiencing? Where do you feel that thought, or just thoughts, feelings, sensations, the visual field, all these things to sort of play with and explore,
That's right.
but that's not recognition already, right? So we play, or we are curious, which can lead to recognition. Is
Yeah,
that
if you
correct
look
or
at
not?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at self-inquiry, let's say, who am I? Most human beings, most identities don't ask that question because there's an assumed obvious, I know who I am. But if we start to actually pick that apart through curiosity and investigation, we find what the essence of self-inquiry is. It's to catalyze a sense of curiosity about what's being assumed. And most of this is assumption. The fact that there might be a sense that there's someone here experiencing even the video that they're watching right now, see if that's an assumption taking place, if there's anyone even watching this video. But another thing to kind of point out to soften the sense of paradox, which might be useful, is going right back to that continuum of the Ouroboros. When we really look at that symbol, it's essentially just a ring, an unending ring. It's a sense of infinity. Paradox is not really two opposing experiences in a linear scale. It's a continuum of experience. Paradox never ceases. So, when
Mm,
we're in the midst of experiencing something that's a paradox because you brought something up that was unique to that, you kind of have to have some curiosity about what's going on internally to even begin to self inquire. So, isn't that interesting? Curiosity has to be there as part of catalyzing curiosity, so it's a continuum of experience nonetheless. It's not two opposing things somehow connected. It's a never ending, no beginning, no ending continuum, something more along the lines. Or we can make that three dimensional. It's a toroidal shape, something that's somehow flowing into itself and out of itself at the same time.
it's just it keeps moving, right? It keeps changing. So then
It keeps
that
moving, it
that
keeps changing, but it also is completely still and it never
yeah,
moves
yeah, yeah.
somehow.
Yes, yeah. So I think that's one of the things that really stuck with me from the talks we had already, is like the no conclusions, which is similar to actually, like you said now, to stay curious, right? To keep looking at this, whatever happens, whatever wants to happen, just keep, keep investigating, you could say,
That's it.
right?
It's engagement. It's
Yeah.
immersion. I mean, we don't actually have a choice but to investigate anyway, because something that you brought up in the very beginning of the conversation is attention does what attention does. There's no one doing that. So you don't really have a
Yes.
choice either, but it does kind of help along the way to have this almost a gentle intention or willingness to engage. Starting to play with that. Is there an avoidance of engagement? Is there a resistance to engagement? If so, there's likely a sensational value to that. Bring all attention into that sensational value and see if there's anything even there at all. And it's so funny. We have these experiences all the time. Sensation is paradoxical. We have an experience that there's something intense feeling here, and then we move all attention into it, and all of a sudden there's nothing there, or there's no intensity, or it's wide, or it's not in here, it's out here, it's both. All of these things tend to happen as we step into the unknown. And so what we're essentially doing is challenging that certainty. Even then, though, to say not to make conclusions, we're not even taking a hard stance with that, because that's what the mind is going to
Mm.
do on its own. It will form conclusions, but we simply look at that conclusion and we just go, maybe. Let the mind form
Yeah.
conclusions. Don't even fight that, but just add a little maybe to it. And what you'll start to see is the conclusions dissolve themselves if we just allow ourselves not to. reach a conclusion and then step back from experience, but we stay immersed even in spite of a conclusion. It dissolves itself, it eats itself. And then here we are again, back thrust into, I guess, what we could call this.
Because most people on the path I've talked to are looking for some end point of being done, right? And it's interesting because a part of experience always continues. We could say, there are sort of different things that can happen, but it's not solid, right? The whole thing is that there is no solidity.
That,
Um,
and also look at the essence of being done. There's assumptions that come after being done that we
yeah.
tend to overlook. So let's just piece it together. If I am done, what does that mean? And we start to find these other steps. It means I don't have to do anything. It means I don't have to engage. It means I can somehow check out, so on and so forth. So what I
I'm no
use,
longer suffering, right? That's a
yeah,
big thing.
and then
Yeah.
people go, that's not true. And that's when doubts start coming up. All doubt is inserting a sense of control in what is already unknown. And that can show up as resistance or avoidance or whatever mechanism that the mind is using. I like to start most conversations with basically saying, you're already done. Here you go. I'm giving you your doneness. And now sit with being done. You're already done. Sit with that. And what people will say is that's when the doubts start firing up. And then they start to recognize the meaning of being done. Being done means I can remove myself from experience because the
Mm.
mind really doesn't want to manage everything. But the way that its method of not managing is disassociation and removal from experience, that buffer that we're speaking to. Unfortunately, that's what suffering is. So instead of being removed from experience, be done and be in the center of that.
And what how does that feel on your side? Like being in the center of doneness. What is that for you?
Um, well, I mean, sometimes it can be rather still, rather quiet. Other times it can be rather intense. But there's always this gentle, curious, energetic inquiry. It doesn't even show up verbally of what's the difference. And what we start to see is that the intensity is the quiet, the suffering is the peace, the pain is the pleasure. These things don't have any differentiation. It's a continuum of experience. And if there's no one here to have a preference, then isn't this the same thing?
Yeah, the curiosity just keeps going, right? The scanning, you could say, the scanning for solidity, whatever, keeps going.
Always. And it goes on
Yeah.
its own.
Yeah. That's that's lovely. Oh, another thing which I love is that you when you're talking about engaging with sensations, right? Because engaging with especially sensations in the body or that can be felt. Because I think feeling for me this was definitely a thing that feeling was definitely the last thing I wanted to do on the
Yeah.
path, right? I wanted to get the insights, watch the videos, or maybe have the cool experiences, but just feel the shitty emotions. That was not per se something I was really,
It's
or
so
the
true.
body. I was not curious about the body for such a long time. It's like
Most
for,
people step into this path so that they can move away from the feelings they don't like. So
yeah,
when you hear the pointing that you can't want this, it's because that's not how this goes. Reality always presents itself as a whole. So if you enter into the context of I'm going to pursue pleasure, you must experience pain because reality
yeah.
presents itself as a whole. We cannot live in a partial reality. That's just not the way that reality is. So the sensations are so crucial here, mainly because that's where our most primary unknown experience is. All sensation is as formless as the air. It's formless, but it may take a context to form because that mind automatically inserts that context. So if I took a glass box and I put a lid on it and sealed it tightly, the air inside that box would conform perfectly to the box. But if I shatter that box, the air doesn't stay in the form of a box because the air isn't the box. It's just living within a context. So when we talk about penetration, what we're talking about is to feel in a way that context isn't determining or objectifying the experience. The experience is speaking for itself. And what that really looks like is, can you feel without thought? Or we can put that
Mm.
another way. Can you bring attention to where there is no thought? And what we find is thought and sensation never touch. They never have touched. There's not a cause and effect relationship there. They are co arising aspects of form. And the only way they are connected is in the emptiness. In the form itself, they are incompatible. So when you experience sensation that completely, what you start to realize is, I am what I feel. And once that realization becomes clear, the boundaries of the body break wide open, the dam bursts, and we realize we are experience itself. Well, how could there be separation now? And how can there be a me if I have nothing to point to that isn't me? If I am that, then how can there be a me?
It's such an interesting thing because especially if there's a clear sense of self left, you can really stay in the illusion of I on one side am sensing something on the other side, right? Maybe in the body, but I'm sensing it like this.
This is good
It's
though.
really
This is a good pointing already. You're pointing right now in a perfect way because
yeah,
it doesn't necessarily fit the construct of the mind, but whatever we see, even we feel. If you see a
yeah.
beautiful flower outside and you really sit with the feeling of that, that will show you that there is no separation. You are feeling that flower. Now, where does that
Mm,
flower begin and where do you end? All of a sudden, there's a realization there. Oh my God, everything is touching. But the mind
exactly.
says, oh, I'm feeling separately from that flower, but that has to be an inserted form of a context. If you just rest in the sensation, it shows you right away that you're feeling the experience. If you're feeling it, it has to be touching.
It's so interesting that we can even um, keep up this self illusion, or most of us can keep up this self illusion, even it's so flimsy and so so when we talk about it, yeah, it's kind of like
I love it.
where is it? Where did we keep it? Because
It
especially with the feelings, like you said, how can you like both the I thought and the feeling, let's say anger or whatever, it's a very especially anger or something like that. It's very like a oneness experience. You're in the anger, right? That's why people feel like they're totally overtook by something, or they're in love. They're in love. They're not, looking
yeah,
at love. They're in
good
love,
point. Good point. I think you've pinpointed exactly how we maintain the identity. And it's simply the relationship we have with the things that we are certain we don't like to feel. That's all it is. Or I could put it another way. The identity lives in your pain. The identity lives in your perception of suffering. Get to know those things very well, and you will find where identity is hiding. And by uncovering that hiding space, it has nowhere to hide any longer. Maybe it's not there at all.
Yeah. Maybe it's not.
Because think
Yeah.
about all the things we do as human beings to move away from these perceived experiences of pain and suffering. Do we even know what pain and suffering is? There's an assumption taking place. Fear, do you know what fear is? When people start to investigate it, they go,
Mm,
I actually have no idea. It's just a thought telling me I don't want to experience this. And then I move into like doing something other than experiencing this. And I've never actually gone directly into the experience with attention. Well, there you go. Now you know
yeah.
the path. This is why we say again, you can't want this because this isn't a relief from suffering. This is becoming suffering. And by becoming suffering, you realize there is no suffering and there never has been.
It's so interesting because fear has never really played a big part in my journey, but recently fear has been sort of a psychedelic experience almost. It's like some a wave of fear is like, whoa. And I've never had that like that. It's very, very interesting how emotions can or yeah, especially stuff like, for example, shame or fear or something. If you're not such an emotional person, it can in the past suddenly unfold like, whoa, okay, this is really it's really there. I was always ashamed of myself. Didn't know that. Um,
It's
it's
beautiful.
I think it's a very interesting thing. And what like on your path, what has been in those in the times that you can remember after the experience you had at in Angelo's dungeon, you could say, basement, right? What are some of the practices or some of the things that helped you? I think most of what you say with the pointers are, of course, related to that as well, because we can only teach from our own experience in our way, right?
Yeah, it's a really good question, mainly because there was no practice or perception of any of this before it became apparent that this is all there is.
Yeah.
Um, I think in a way that that type of intuitive perspective is clean and pure because it's not tainted by a theme or an approach that has a specific methodology. And at the same time, sometimes those insights that come up can seem rather strange or unique to people. But one thing that's come up consistently is an iterative experience into stepping into sensation in the midst of our everyday experience. And I'm not telling people not to meditate because meditation clearly starts to point in its own way. But as we are going throughout our day and we're very much mind identified, to insert pattern interrupts on a regular basis and to step into what we feel, primarily using a cell phone. Wow, that's
Yeah.
if you set a notification every hour on, doesn't have to be exactly on the hour. And when that goes off, that notification on your phone, to stop everything that you're doing in your mind and in your outward environment and to step into sensation for 5 minutes, it begins to break something up. It begins to break up a certain pattern of continuity and thought. And that right there starts to open these little gaps that we can become extremely curious about. And as that happens, what a lot of people report, I've worked with maybe 2,000 people at this point. People report around day 12 or 14 of doing this every hour while they're awake every day, that they suddenly wake up in the morning and they feel really like a good sense of well being, but they don't know why. And it makes perfect sense because the mind cannot keep track of feeling because it cannot feel. In other words, we can't even remember a feeling unless we're feeling it now. So we start to realize that there's aspects of the mind that begin to fall away, and it kind of shows up in this koan or this inquiry. What is the last thought that you have forgotten? Is kind of how that shows up. In other words, once it's forgotten, it's gone. It's an emptiness now. And it seems like these mechanisms, as we interrupt them, they begin to fall away. And we see this in acting too. People that take on method acting, like Jim Carrey did for Man on the Moon, or Daniel Day-Lewis, or Heath Ledger, or any of these famous method actors, they put their identity on the shelf and then they become something new, something that they're in the midst of discovering. When they pick up that identity again that they put on the shelf, there are pieces that are missing that they don't even realize are missing. But everybody will tell them, there's something different about you, Jim. And as you probably know, Jim Carrey's undergone quite a vivid spiritual transformation throughout his career, and it's directly attributed to the same thing. If is every time we interrupt those patterns, pieces fall away and they never reassemble, what does that leave in the gap? And we start to find truest nature there.
It's so interesting that when we bring a little bit mindfulness or awareness, it's kind of like the mindfulness we're bringing brings already it brings about this processing or dissolving of what we experience already. And it's kind of like before we're sort of saving everything, I feel, or carrying it around maybe. And then when we sort of start with this processing, or start being conscious throughout the day, right? Meditating off the pillow, sort of active meditation. Then we're bringing in more of this awareness or this processing. I feel that it's
That's it. That mindfulness piece in exactly what you're saying, what it does is it breaks up a sense of continuity that is based on certainty and conclusion.
mm,
That's all it is. So
yeah.
I
For me,
recommend.
yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I think there
No,
was
no, no.
a delay.
No. For me, that felt I was like doing um, meditation, especially. I was thinking that was for a while. I thought that was the only form of meditation out there. was the do nothing meditation, just sit down, do nothing. And then I started to, in an insight I had, I understood that I could just surrender. I could just basically let go of the whole thought control idea thing. Even though there was a solid sense of self, I thought that sense of self could just chill, baby, basically, because it was already carried. And then I started to, with that, I started to take my meditation off the pillow. I started to let myself be guided sort of while I walk,
Beautiful.
and that felt
That's beautiful.
so interesting. I was just biking through the city without any clue where I was going, and always found these nice places. And yeah, that is, well, that's for me a little bit of my journey, but that's how I actually, what you're saying resonates with that so much.
That's exactly it. What an intrepid explorer we all are. We have this boldness of exploration if we just start to allow it. And that's exactly what you're demonstrating there is what lives in the gaps of what I'm sure about. And here's another approach that you can take mindfully just for anybody who's watching. Pay attention to your identity at work, at home, around your family, around your lover, around your kids, and see if there's the same person there, or is it just the same one observing? If that's the case, you'll start to see gaps in identity because there's not a singular identity, it's just a series of mechanisms that show up based on the conditions. You can also look
I
at
lo-
your social public identity, your social media identity. It just goes.
if we think of identity as just a thought, right? Then I love the thing where people say is like you can only have one thought at the same time. So when we can only have one thought and our whole identity is this collection of thought, then one thought is at the forefront at that moment when we're either with the family or, and it's very interesting to see that the behavior patterns in that. So yeah,
Hmm.
that's really lovely.
Hmm.
So I wanted to ask you about the cosmic joke because part of where we were talking about the doing non-doing thing, but I think the cosmic joke for many people is this lovely insight, but again, like with words, it's seeing that everything is already the case, right? It's just all this striving, this looking at YouTube like this or things like that, while we were actually the whole all the time already that, and and already complete or already happy maybe even, and
Already full.
yeah, it's very interesting how you, yeah, how for you that has, I'm curious how that for you has shown up, or how do you see that show up for people around you or you work with?
It's an interesting question. I think it seems like this. Some people perceive the cosmic joke as recognizing the absurdity in the fighting, in the struggling, in the suffering, in the seeking, even. Other people see, I think everyone eventually kind of sees it this way, but it's also that this is not what you could possibly imagine or expect. And the nature of
Mm.
humor is what we would call get versus expect. When I set you up for a joke and your mind imagines how that joke's going to finish and then you get the surprise, that's when you laugh. But this is the key word, is the surprise, because more than even the willingness to wake up or the willingness to be challenged, we have to set the intention to be perpetually and never endingly surprised in this adventure, because that is the nature of this reality. It cannot be predicted at all. In fact, as soon as we attempt to predict it, it is not so. And so that's the cosmic joke, is it's not anything you can imagine, and it's not the way that you think it could be. So when it reveals itself in the intricate, it's not even intricate, I would say vivid or bold simplicity of what this is, it almost suddenly becomes absurd. And we laugh and we laugh and we cry and we cry at this. And we
Yeah,
laugh and we cry because it really is more simple than you could possibly imagine. It's so simple, it's already done. It's already
yeah,
obvious.
because what's very funny is because people can look back on that and then think, for all these years, I've tried so hard. While it was already okay, I was already here. But then there was never another option. And there was no other timeline for you to live or other, it's like there was already no control or no self or no, you know, no free will or however you like to call it. Well, it's already free, but it's not your choice. You could say.
Well, and really that kind of gives us some insight around free will too. If we look at the nature of free will, whatever experience is, if there's an agent here to do something about it, then it almost creates a requirement to do something about it, which that's not freedom.
Hmm.
Free will doesn't exist because will itself can never be free. If you
Yeah,
want
because
freedom,
yeah,
there's no will there. It's helplessness.
because when you are in this idea, or in my life, when I was in this idea of me having control or me changing everything, there was never a sense of I can also just not interfere.
Right.
I can also just let it happen. That was never an option in that. There was always all these, I could, stick my fingers in here or stick them in there, but there was no, I could just leave it.
This is the Sisyphus myth. The man who is doomed by the gods to push the boulder up the hill every day. There's so many pieces in that metaphor that are so juicy that really relate directly to what seems to be individual experience. One of which is conditioning. He's conditioned by the gods, he's doomed to do so. But it shows what conditioning truly is. We take these outside forces as children and we start to apply them to ourselves. And then we essentially enter into a state of Stockholm syndrome where we fall in love with our captor that is the conditioning itself. And the only way we learn to orient who we are is based on our conditioning. That's interesting. Your identity is just simply conditioning. If there's no conditioning, is there an identity? And then we start looking at the boulder as, oh, does he push the boulder because he wants to push the boulder? We start to see all the pieces that are combined. Sisyphus pushes the boulder because he thinks he has to. He thinks there's a requirement. And then he takes another step and says, it's good that I push the boulder. And then he takes another step and says, it's right that I push the boulder. And then he takes another step and says, I like to push the boulder. I want to push the boulder. But when we start removing all those layers and we get down to that fundamental sense of I have to push the boulder, and then we go, no, I don't. That's where we discover freedom. There's no have to at all.
It's so interesting. As you were saying this, I was also thinking about like people are not the same when they're 8 years old, when they're 16 years old, when they're 20 years old, when they're at work at 26 or 29, or when they're 50. It's all these different ages we're actually acting out different conditionings, you could say, even though they're maybe from derived from the same society or same parents or same friends even, but actually our identity, even if we think it's solid, in time, or well, even in memory, you could say, or as a thought, it is not even consistent
Right. Nothing
because we
consistent.
act so different, like in a suit at the office, or like you said, in different situations
Go
or
go
in
into
different
a public
times.
bathroom. Go into a public bathroom and see if your identity changes.
Yeah.
There's somebody else at the urinal and you go stand next to them. Is it the same identity or do you take on something else? Even those things show up. And if you pay enough attention, you'll start to see, oh, how can there be a consistent me if it's always changing based on conditions? So is there anyone here at all, or is it just the conditions?
For me, I had it with I was sitting with a friend and we were going to parties, and he always said like he at some point said to me like very clearly, like when you enter a party you become somebody else. And that was so interesting for me as a cue of wait, I'm putting on all these masks.
for sure.
Well, well, Josh, I don't know how you are in time, but thank you so much
Mm,
for our conversation. As you say, very juicy. I really
juicy.
like that.
That's real juicy. You have to do it with a Scottish accent. You have to say it like this. The whole, yeah, juicy, juicy.
Juicy now. No, but I really love this, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah,
And
thank you for inviting me.
yeah, we could have like I think we could continue for 4 hours, but let's let's keep it at this and keep it watchable. So thank you so much for your time, Josh.
Thanks, my friend. And yeah, I guess I'll speak with you soon.